On the edge of a dead star system, a planet named Karak-Vone was learning a simple truth. Running does not matter when your hunter can laugh in vacuum. The bounty was supposed to be clean, alive if possible, dead if convenient. Most hunters treated that wording like a leash. Lobo treated it like a punchline. He found the target city by following the smoke of its own panic. He landed his bike through the roof of a fortified courthouse because doors were for people who believed in consequences. The building folded inward like paper hit by a hammer. Then Lobo stood in the dust, grinning, chain hooked at his belt, eyes bright with the kind of joy only a professional menace can feel. The fugitive was a planet-level tyrant with a private army and a shrine made of stolen bones. He made speeches about destiny. He promised his followers salvation through cruelty. He was the kind of villain who thought he invented evil because nobody had ever laughed at him while tearing his armored door off its hinges. Lobo laughed. The first bullets hit him. They were big enough to punch through light vehicles. They mushroomed against his chest and fell to the floor like coins. He looked down, offended, as if someone had spilled a drink on his boots. Then he moved, not like a soldier, not like an assassin, like a bar fight that learned how to walk. He tore through the guard line with bare hands, ripping weapons away and using them as clubs, tossing bodies into walls hard enough to leave silhouettes. He found the tyrant's inner chamber and kicked it open. The tyrant screamed orders, trying to sound like a god. Lobo walked straight through the hail of fire, took the man by the throat, and lifted him until his feet scrambled uselessly in the air. The tyrant tried bargaining. Credits. Entire continents. Lobo listened like he was considering the menu. Then Lobo snapped his neck, not because it was necessary, but because it saved time. Outside, the tyrant's army still fought, still clung to discipline, still believed they were part of a story with meaning. Lobo stepped out into the square with the corpse over his shoulder like a trophy fish. The army froze. They expected fear. They expected a speech. Lobo dropped the body into the fountain. Blood made the water look like cheap wine. He pointed at the crowd with a lazy threat. Anyone who wanted revenge could line up. Anyone who wanted mercy could pray. Either way, he was bored already. He walked back to his bike and roared away as the planet's power grid began to die behind him. Not from strategy, but from the explosion of a fuel depot he had punched just to see if it would go. The pay was decent. The loot was better. Among the tyrant's vault of stolen tech sat a black obelisk wrapped in warning sigils from a dozen civilizations. A trans-dimensional engine humming softly, as if it was trying to remember what reality tasted like. The tyrant had collected it as a trophy, never daring to use it. The kind of artifact that made cautious people sweat. Lobo licked his teeth and wheeled it into his ship like a kid dragging a stolen arcade machine home. Hours later, he was in open space, floating in the quiet between stars. He had crates of contraband stacked like furniture, a keg lashed to the wall, and a still warm satisfaction buzzing in his skull. The engine was bolted to the deck with chains that looked absurdly thin against its weight. He sat cross-legged in front of it, running a hand along its surface, feeling the vibration travel into his bones. His ship's sensors whined. The engine did not match any map. It did not fit any known physics. It was a door without a handle. Lobo grinned and hit it. The first pulse was a low thunder that shook the hull. The second pulse was a scream, not audible but felt, like the universe briefly remembered pain. The third pulse cracked the air itself. Colors bled out of nowhere. Geometry stuttered. The stars outside the viewport stretched into long white scars, as if the ship was being dragged by the throat. Lobo's grin widened. Something interesting. Then reality collapsed, not like an explosion, not like a tear. Like a trapdoor opening under existence. The ship lurched sideways through a direction that did not exist. The walls rippled, becoming liquid for a heartbeat, and the engine's hum turned into a choir of wrong voices speaking in languages that had never touched human ears. Lobo grabbed for the controls and felt them melt under his fingers, then reform as something else. The air in the cabin thickened, tasting of hot iron and old prayers. His ship's lights flickered, revealing shadows that did not match any object. He had traveled through dimensions before. He had punched holes in physics. He had ridden through hells and back alleys of the multiverse. But this was different. This was not a place you visited. This was a place that visited you. The viewport showed a sea of color like bruises on a living sky. violet storms, green lightning, rivers of fire twisting into faces that vanished when he stared at them. Somewhere in that churning madness, enormous shapes moved, not ships, not beasts, but concepts wearing flesh. Lobo's laughter faltered for the first time in a long time. Not from fear, not exactly. From recognition. The instinct that said this place did not care how tough he was. It cared what he was. The ship began to come apart. Bolts unthreaded themselves. Panels peeled away like skin. The obelisk engine glowed brighter, delighted as if it had finally found the ocean it belonged in. Lobo snarled and tried to rip it free. The chain snapped with a sound like snapping bone. The engine did not move. Instead, the floor moved around it. A pressure pressed in from all sides, not just physical. The weight of despair, the sweetness of rage, the cold logic of betrayal, the intoxicating perfume of indulgence. Feelings became gravity. Lobo clenched his fists. He had no patience for guilt, no room for regret. He had built his life like a fortress against meaning. He had always been the punchline, the interruption, the thing that ruined someone else's grand narrative. But here, narrative was a weapon. He heard whispering. Temptations. Invitations to become something else, something truer, something eternal. He saw visions in the storm. Worlds burning, armies kneeling, a throne of skulls, a palace of sensation, a labyrinth of impossible plans, a garden of rot that laughed kindly. Lobo spat. His spit floated, then turned into a tiny screaming face and dissolved. He felt something brush his mind, testing him like a predator testing a cage. It was vast, and it noticed him the way a shark notices blood. For the first time in his immortal life, Lobo did not feel like the biggest problem in the room. He felt like fresh meat. The ship finally broke. Metal and glass and stolen treasure spun out into the storm. Lobo was thrown free, tumbling end over end, and in the distance his bike drifted after him like a loyal dog, chasing its master into hell. He tried to orient himself, but there was no up, no down, no stars. Only the warp, the psychic ocean of another universe, boiling with the dreams of 1,000,000,000,000 terrified souls. Something laughed in the darkness. Not Lobo. Something that sounded like war itself learning how to speak. And Lobo, the galaxy's most unstoppable pastiche, roared back at it, not because he was brave, but because the only prayer he had ever known was defiance. The warp did not greet him with silence. It greeted him like a crowd. Shapes gathered in the storm, drawn by the scent of his presence. They came like sharks to blood, like flies to rot, like worshippers to a miracle. They were demons, but not the simple horned cartoons of lesser nightmares. These were thoughts given teeth, emotions given claws. They wore armor made of hatred and masks made of desire. They circled Lobo as he drifted, and the air around him thickened with chanting. Names were spoken that were not names, but titles of suffering. Each demon could taste his rage, his arrogance, his endless violence, and they thought, like all predators, that they had found something corruptible. One of them approached first, tall and elegant, its skin a shifting mirror of faces. It smiled with a mouth that held too many tongues. It offered him pleasure beyond imagination, an eternity of indulgence, a throne built from the screams of admirers. It showed him visions of crowds chanting his name, worlds paying tribute, galaxies begging for his attention. Lobo stared at it with the blank expression of a man being offered salad. Then he punched through its face. The demon shattered like glass and reformed instantly behind him, laughing, delighted. It tried again, pressing images into his mind. Riches, worship, meaning. Lobo rolled his eyes and snapped its neck, even though it did not have a proper spine. The neck twisted anyway, because reality and the warp obeyed narrative, and Lobo's narrative was simple. Hit it until it stops. More came. Red-skinned brutes with axes larger than tanks, roaring for blood. They offered him battle without end, slaughter sanctified, rage made holy. They promised him a place at the foot of a skull throne, a champion of corn, forever killing, forever celebrated. Lobo's grin returned. That one at least spoke his language. He let the first brute swing. The axe carved through him, splitting his torso cleanly in half. For a heartbeat his body drifted apart, organs floating like obscene fruit. The demon roared in triumph. Then Lobo regenerated. Flesh knitted, bones reformed, blood reversed course as if embarrassed. He snapped back together like a bad habit. The demon blinked, confused, and Lobo headbutted it hard enough to crack its skull. The brute staggered. Lobo tore its arm off and used it to beat the demon's own face in until it popped like an overripe melon. The warp responded with hunger. The storm thickened, trying to press him into a shape it could understand. Shadows crawled into his mind, looking for fear, looking for shame, looking for weakness. They found none of the usual doors. Not because Lobo was pure. Not because he resisted temptation with virtue. But because temptation assumed you wanted to be worse, and Lobo had already gone past worse into something else entirely. He did not crave power because he already acted like he owned the universe. He did not crave pleasure because he could take it whenever he felt like it. He did not crave meaning because he had spent centuries proving meaning was a joke. He was not a soul to be corrupted. He was corruption that wore a leather jacket. The demons realized it in fragments, the way insects realize a flame is hot only after they are already burning. Their laughter turned uneasy. Their whispers turned cautious. One of the storm's more clever creatures, a shifting thing of feathers and eyes, tried a different approach. It did not tempt him with joy or rage. It tempted him with purpose. It showed him a bounty board made of prophecy. It showed him targets across this new galaxy. It offered him a role in the great game, a hunter for Tzeentch, a piece on an infinite chessboard. Lobo listened, rubbing his chin as if thinking. Then he reached out, grabbed the demon by the beak and ripped its head off. He held the head up like a beer mug. Warp fire poured from its neck stump. Lobo gulped it anyway, gagged and spat. Even in hell, there were things that tasted bad. They swarmed him after that, angry now and salted. Claws tore him apart. Teeth shredded him. Warp lightning reduced him to ash. For a moment there was nothing left but drifting vapor, the outline of his body erased. Then the vapor laughed. His regeneration was not clean. It was violent. His atoms remembered stubbornness. His cells reassembled with spite. He came back in a burst of flesh and blood, snarling, grabbing the nearest demon and using it as a shield while he tore through the rest. He fought with bare hands because weapons felt too polite. He ripped horns off and stabbed eyes. He swung one demon into another like a flail. He bit a creature's throat out and chewed, spitting chunks into the storm. The warp hated him, but it could not digest him. It could not rewrite him. It could only throw itself at him again and again, and each time it did, Lobo got more entertained. At last, in the middle of the chaos, he grabbed a demon by the spine and yanked hard, tearing it free in one long wet pull. The creature screamed, its body collapsing like a puppet with cut strings. Lobo straddled its back, jammed his fingers into its skull like reins, and rode it. The demon bucked, trying to throw him off. Lobo whooped and punched it in the head until it flew straight, like a horse learning manners through trauma. He rode that screaming beast deeper into the storm, through curtains of living color, past islands of bone and floating cathedrals of flesh. The warp opened around him like a mouth. Somewhere far away in a realm of blood and brass, a god of slaughter paused. Somewhere in a palace of sensation, a god of excess leaned forward with interest. Somewhere in a labyrinth of plans, a god of change smiled slowly. Somewhere in a garden of rot, a god of decay chuckled. Chaos had found a new toy. Then Chaos felt something colder, because the creature they were watching was not becoming their champion. He was becoming their hunter. The warp spat him out like a bad taste. Lobo burst from a tear in the sky over a hive world whose name had been reduced to a number on bureaucratic parchment. Below him stretched a city that was not a city but a continent of stacked misery, metal mountains stitched together with cables and prayers. Smog choked the air. Fires burned in a dozen districts. Sirens wailed like dying animals. He fell through the atmosphere trailing warp lightning, still astride the demon he had ridden like a sled. The creature disintegrated as it hit real space, turning into ash and screaming echoes. Lobo kept falling. For a moment he saw the battle beneath him. Green-skinned orcs swarming like a tide of muscle and scrap metal, roaring, firing guns that looked like they had been built by punching junk until it resembled a weapon. Chaos cultists alongside them, masked, chanting, spilling blood into the gutters as if the hive itself were an altar. Imperial guard lines breaking and reforming under the weight of the assault. Tanks burning. Aircraft spiraling down through the smoke. He hit the ground in the middle of it all, cratered concrete exploding outward. Orks nearby were thrown off their feet. A Chaos champion in jagged armor stumbled back, raising a chain blade. Lobo stood up from the impact, dusting ash from his shoulders like he had just stepped out of a bar fight. He looked around. He heard the guns. He smelled the blood. He tasted the fear on the air, sharp and metallic. And he smiled. Not the smile of a hero arriving to save the day. The smile of a man walking into a casino and realizing the house is on fire and nobody is leaving until someone wins. The Chaos champion charged, screaming devotion. Lobo met him halfway and tore the chain blade out of his hands. The blade bit into Lobo's palm, drawing blood. Lobo raised an eyebrow, impressed. He swung the weapon back and cleaved the champion from shoulder to hip. The man fell apart in 2 pieces, still trying to chant as his lungs collapsed. Orks saw that and roared louder. Some fired wildly. Others rushed him just to see if the rumor of his toughness was true. Lobo slammed into them like a meteor with fists. He punched one orc so hard its head disappeared. He grabbed another by the jaw and used it as a club to smash 3 more. He laughed when a crude rocket hit him in the chest and blew him apart in a shower of gore. He laughed harder when he regenerated before the smoke cleared, stepping out of his own blood like it was a curtain. The Imperials on the nearby line stared, unsure what they were seeing. A figure, tall and pale, with eyes like blue fire, fighting like a nightmare, wearing a grin. Some thought he was a demon. Some thought he was a sanctioned weapon. Some, in their terror, thought he might be an angel of the Emperor's wrath. The Orks decided he was something better. They began to chant, not words exactly, but a rhythmic bellow. Lobo, 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 Lobo. Like they had found a new war boss, a myth dropping from the sky. Lobo heard it and waved at them sarcastically as if acknowledging fans. Then he spotted something truly fun. A tank column was trying to break through a street choked with wreckage. An Imperial Lemon Russ was trading shells with an Ork battle wagon made of welded plates and arrogance. Each shot lit the haze with brief white suns. Infantry died in the crossfire like insects. Lobo sprinted into the line of fire, dodging nothing because dodging was effort. A shell detonated beside him, tearing his arm off. He picked the severed arm up and threw it like a javelin, impaling a cultist. Then he leapt onto the Ork battle wagon, punching through its armor with his fist, ripping out the engine block and hurling it into the air. The engine landed on an Imperial tank, crushing it. The guard crew died screaming inside. Lobo winced. That had not been intentional. Then he shrugged. War was messy. The Orks cheered anyway. They did not care who died as long as it was loud. Above the hive, the ground began to tremble with a heavier rhythm. Not tanks. Not artillery. Something colossal. A titan. It emerged through the smoke like a walking cathedral of steel, banners hanging from its limbs, cannons the size of buildings. Its void shields crackled as Ork rockets hammered it harmlessly. Its plasma weapon fired, vaporizing an entire block, turning 1,000 lives into steam. On the other side of the battlefield, an Ork Gargan answered, a crude Titan equivalent, stomping forward with guns bolted onto every surface, belching smoke and laughter. The 2 giants turned the war into a myth. Every soldier on the ground became a footnote. Lobo looked up at them with interest. He had fought big things before, but this was a different kind of big. This was a monument to belief, a machine that walked because an empire prayed it should. He ran toward it. Bolter fire raked him as he crossed into a new zone of the battlefield, black armored figures on a distant rooftop thinking he was an enemy. The rounds punched into him, explosive, tearing chunks out. He kept running, leaving a trail of regenerating wounds behind him like a joke told in blood. He reached the Titan's leg as it stepped over a trench full of corpses. He grabbed hold of the armor plating and began to climb, hand over hand, laughing as the machine tried to shake him off. Inside the Titan, crew screamed alarms. Spirits of machine logic howled through cables. The princeps felt something crawling on the sacred hull like a parasite. Lobo punched through a maintenance hatch and dropped into an interior corridor filled with incense and humming wires. Servitors turned toward him, their faces replaced with metal. He snapped their necks anyway out of habit. He followed the sound of human voices to the core. There he found priests in red robes chanting and the princeps wired into the throne, eyes rolling white with machine trance. They saw him and froze. Lobo waved. Then he ripped a cable out of the wall and yanked. Sparks exploded. The Titan stumbled. Outside, its foot misstepped and the Gargan's cannon hit its knee joint. Armor shattered. The Titan fell. The impact was seismic. A mile of city shook. Buildings collapsed. The Titan, a holy relic, lay on its side like a slain god. Orks roared in triumph. Imperials wailed in horror. Lobo climbed out onto the wrecked hull and stood there, arms raised, soaking in the noise. To the Orks, he looked like the perfect war spirit. To the Imperium, he looked like a warp-spawned calamity. To Lobo, it was just a really good afternoon. In the distance, more Imperial forces arrived, gunships roaring overhead, Vox chatter panicked. Orders were being screamed into the wind. Identify the anomaly. Contain the anomaly. Kill the anomaly. Lobo looked toward the arriving reinforcements with a grin that promised nothing good. He had no idea where he was. But wherever it was violent. And that meant finally he might not get bored. The Imperium did not understand mercy. It understood classification. Within hours, the Hive world's surviving commanders filed reports full of terrified contradictions. A pale giant, a Xenos, a demon, a saint, a war god. The data was useless, but one fact repeated across every transmission. The figure could not be killed. It laughed at artillery. It climbed Titan. It made Orks cheer. That last part in particular offended the Imperium's sense of order. So the Inquisition arrived, not with banners or speeches, but with quiet ships and sealed orders. The kind of arrival that made even generals swallow hard. Black-clad agents stepped onto the shattered streets with retinues of stormtroopers, psychers, and devices wrapped in sacred cloth. They did not come to win the war. They came to remove the problem. They found Lobo where everyone eventually found him. In the ruins of a command bunker, drinking from a stolen canteen, feet propped on a dead orc like a chair. He looked up as they entered. He saw the symbol on their armor and laughed. It sounded like he had just recognized an old joke. The lead Inquisitor spoke in a voice trained to command confession. Identify yourself. Submit to Imperial authority. You are to be detained for examination. Lobo blinked slowly, as if translating the sentence into something meaningful. Then he said, "Nah." Stormtroopers opened fire. Hot loss beams filled the bunker, slicing through smoke. Lobo let them hit him. His skin burned, flesh charred. He kept drinking unimpressed until half his face was gone. The Inquisitor raised a hand and activated a null field. The air changed. Psychers winced. The warp presence in the room dulled, as if someone had thrown a blanket over reality. Inquisitorial tech had one purpose: to turn off the supernatural. Lobo felt it like a pressure drop. He frowned, annoyed, like a smoker whose cigarette had been snatched. Then he stood up. The trooper stopped firing, confused. The null field should have weakened a demon. It should have made warp spawn falter. Instead, the pale giant rolled his shoulders and cracked his neck. He was not being sustained by the warp. He was being sustained by pure stubbornness and biology that refused to accept death as valid paperwork. He walked toward them. Troopers tried to bayonet him. He broke their arms. He grabbed one man by the helmet and slammed him into the wall hard enough to weld the armor into the concrete. The Inquisitor signaled the Psychers. They reached into the immaterial, pushing past the null field's edge with effort, and struck at Lobo's mind. Images flooded him. Guilt. Visions of everything he had done, every life he had ended, every world he had scarred. They tried to find remorse. They found laughter. Lobo's mind was not a cathedral. It was a bar fight. The Psychers recoiled, vomiting blood. One screamed as if he had stared into a sun made of profanity. The Inquisitor tried relics next. A containment shackle etched with wards. A stasis grenade. A halo of binding. Lobo let them slap the shackle on his wrist. It flared with light. The air hummed. For a moment his movement slowed. The Inquisitor's eyes sharpened. Then Lobo flexed. The shackle snapped like cheap jewelry. He tossed it back into the Inquisitor's hands as if returning a broken toy. They finally did what the Imperium always did when confused. They escalated. A prison ship descended into orbit. Lobo was hit with a barrage that reduced the bunker to rubble. Then a gravnet pinned him to the ground. Then a dozen armored troopers dog-piled him, chaining him like a myth being buried. They hauled him aboard in pieces because he had been blown apart twice on the way up, but his pieces kept trying to crawl back together. On the prison ship, they sealed him in a cell lined with holy sigils and null emitters. They watched him through thick glass. Lobo sat on the floor, staring at the wall like a bored inmate. Then he started humming. The ship's servitors detected stress fractures in containment plating. The null field flickered. The Inquisitor demanded diagnostics. Tech priests muttered prayers. Lobo yawned and punched the wall. The first punch dented plastio. The second punch through. The third tore a hole large enough for him to crawl through, and when he did, alarms screamed as if the ship had realized it had made a bad decision. He moved through the corridors like a riot. Troopers fired. He used their bodies as shields. He ripped a door off and surfed it down a hallway like a sled, laughing as bullets sparked off metal. He reached the hangar and found ships. He did not pick the smallest. He picked the biggest. A cruiser, ancient, armored, full of people who believed its mass made it safe. He hijacked it by killing the bridge crew and sitting in the captain's chair like he belonged there. When the ship tried to lock him out, he broke the control panel and flew it anyway by feel, like steering a drunk beast by yanking its horns. The Inquisition sent desperate vox messages. "Stand down. You are condemned. This vessel is sacred property." Lobo replied by broadcasting one sentence across every channel. "Finders keepers." He vanished into the void, leaving the inquisitorial fleet scrambling. Hours later, a chaos warband trying to intercept him found itself boarded. Their champion was chained, gagged, and stuffed into a cargo bay. Lobo had discovered that in this galaxy, people paid good money for trophies. He sold the captured Chaos Champion back to an Imperial Admiral as proof he could do the impossible, then stole the Admiral's flagship as payment. Within days, the Imperium issued an official designation that tried to turn Chaos into paperwork. Hostile Xenos demigod-class anomaly. It was the closest thing they had to an admission of helplessness. Lobo read the wanted bulletin later, laughed until he snorted, and pinned it to his ship's wall like a souvenir. In the warp, attention is power. And now the warp was paying attention to Lobo. It began subtly. Whispers in the storm when his ship passed through unstable corridors of space. Sudden dreams that were not his. Voices purring promises through the hum of engines. The gods of chaos did not speak like mortals. They spoke like weather, like gravity, like addiction. Khorne noticed first, because Khorne always noticed blood. The moment Lobo tore through armies and laughed, a shadow in the realm of brass leaned closer. 1,000 skulls clattered as if the throne itself shifted to get a better view. Slaanesh noticed because Lobo did everything with pleasure. Even violence, especially violence. There was an artistry in his cruelty that made the Prince of Excess curious, a curiosity that tasted like perfume and poison. T-Sanch noticed because Lobo was a variable that refused to be predicted. A creature dropped into the great game like a beer bottle thrown onto a chessboard. Nurgle noticed last, chuckling, because even Rot respected persistence, and Lobo's refusal to stay dead was, in its own ugly way, admirable. They tried to tempt him, each in their own language. On a dead moon drifting near a warp rift, Lobo found a shrine built from skulls arranged like a staircase. At the top sat a massive axe buried in stone, humming with rage. The air around it shimmered with heat. Any warrior who touched it would feel their muscles swell, their fury sanctified. A weapon offered by Khorne itself. Lobo stared at it, interested. He reached out, grabbed the axe, and ripped it free. For a moment the warp trembled in approval. The moon sky turned red. Blood rain fell. Lobo felt a surge of power throb through his veins like a drumbeat. Then he said nice and used the axe to chop the shrine apart for firewood. Khorne's attention sharpened, confused. The gift had been accepted but not obeyed. On a decadent pleasure world swallowed halfway by warp influence, Lobo walked through streets of silk and screaming music. Demonettes danced on balconies, offering ecstasy beyond human limits. The air itself tasted like desire. Slaanesh's presence curled around him like a lover's arm. A figure approached, impossibly beautiful, eyes like galaxies. It offered him companionship, a throne beside the Dark Prince. An eternity of sensation. Lobo grinned, leaned in close, and said he was flattered. Then he stole the figure's jewelry and walked away. Slaanesh laughed, delighted, then angry, then delighted again. Insult was a kind of intimacy. T-Sanch tried a different trap. It offered him knowledge, a map of bounties across the Immaterium. Names of Greater Daemons, secret pathways, the true names that could bind them. It dangled possibility like bait. Lobo listened, rubbing his chin. Then he said, "Sure, write it down." The moment the demon scribe began, Lobo broke its fingers one by one and took the parchment anyway. Chaos learned something humiliating. Lobo could not be recruited because recruitment implied hierarchy. It implied he would become someone's piece. Lobo did not do pieces. He did not do sides. He did not do worship. He did bound, because the grimdark future, for all its horror, still ran on currency, still ran on favors, contracts, rivalries. Even the most holy crusade needed supplies. Even chaos champions wanted trophies. And where there were trophies, there was profit. Lobo started asking around. He found a rogue trader with more greed than sense and offered a service. He would retrieve anything from anywhere, including the warp, for a price. The rogue trader laughed until Lobo punched through the man's desk. The laughter stopped. Deals were made. His first hunt was almost accidental. A greater demon of corn had manifested on a battlefield, a towering beast of brass and muscle, slaughtering entire regiments. The Imperium could not stop it. The Orks loved it. Chaos worshipped it. Lobo saw the thing and thought, that looks expensive. He charged it. The demon swung a blade that could split tanks. Lobo took the hit, losing half his torso, then regenerated mid-swing and climbed up the demon's arm like a man climbing a tree. He jammed his fingers into its eye sockets and tore. The demon roared, warp fire spraying. Lobo laughed and headbutted it until its skull cracked. The demon tried to dissolve back into the warp. Lobo grabbed its horns and held on, refusing to let it retreat. Reality buckled as the creature screamed its true name in panic. Lobo screamed louder. When it finally died, it did not leave a corpse. It left a collapsing echo, a psychic afterimage. But Lobo had planned for that. He had brought a containment jar etched with warding symbols he did not understand and did not respect. He shoved the demon's essence into it like stuffing smoke into a bottle. Then he sold it. The buyer was a Chaos Lord who wanted the jar as a trophy. The Chaos Lord paid in warp-tainted gold and a ship full of weapons. Lobo took the payment, then killed the Chaos Lord anyway, because betrayal was faster than negotiation. Word spread, quietly at first, like rumors in a prison. Then loudly, like screams in a cathedral. There was a hunter. Not an Imperial assassin. Not a Grey Knight exorcist. Something else. Something that treated demon princes like game animals. Demon worlds began to feel unsafe. In the warp, demons are predators by nature. They are the nightmare that hunts the living. But now, in certain corners of the Immaterium, demons began to run. Lobo entered those corners like a drunk tourist. He kicked open gates of screaming bone. He rode his bike across rivers of living blood. He tossed grenades into demon feasts just to watch them scatter. When a greater demon tried to bargain, offering him worship, he asked how much it was worth. When a demon tried to threaten him with eternal torment, he yawned and asked if it came with free drinks. He became a problem chaos could not solve the way it solved other problems. You could not seduce him because he was already indulgence. You could not enrage him because rage was his baseline. You could not outplan him because he did not play by plans. You could not rot him because he regenerated with laughter. The gods watched as their servants fell, not to faith, not to purity, but to boredom armed with fists. Corn began to feel a new emotion in its realm. Not anger, not joy. A champion of slaughter being dragged screaming into a jar was not glorious. Slaanesh felt something like jealousy. Not because Lobo refused worship, but because he treated excess like casual entertainment. Tisanche felt irritation. The variable refused to become a pattern. Nurgle, strangely, laughed the hardest, because what is more disgusting than a creature that refuses even decay? Eventually, Chaos tried to kill him properly. They arranged an ambush in the warp, a trap that would have erased a fleet. A convergence of demonic legions, a storm of psychic pressure designed to crush souls. They baited him with the promise of a mythical prey, a beast said to have eaten sons. Lobo showed up on time. He looked at the armies gathering around him, at the towering demons, at the sky made of screaming faces. He whistled, impressed. Then he cracked his knuckles. The battle that followed was not a war. It was sport. Lobo tore through demons with the casual cruelty of a man picking fights at a bar that had no exits. He died a dozen times. Each death was an inconvenience. Each resurrection was a punchline. By the end, the trap was a graveyard of broken concepts. The warp itself churned in confusion. Chaos had tried to be the hunter. Now chaos was learning what it felt like to be prey. The Imperium could tolerate many horrors as long as they fit a category. Lobo did not fit. And when something does not fit, the Imperium sends its sharpest knife. Space Marines arrived, not as an army, but as a verdict. A strike force drawn from chapters that did not ask permission. Black Templars, zealous and relentless, their prayers as heavy as their armor. Space Wolves, feral and laughing, recognizing a kindred brutality but refusing to bow to it. Or perhaps Grey Knights, silent and cold, carrying wards that burned the eyes, hunting anything touched by the warp. Whoever they were, they found Lobo on a battlefield that had become his playground. He was standing on a pile of Ork corpses, arguing with a Chaos champion about payment. The champion was missing an arm. Lobo was missing an eye. Both were smiling. Then the Space Marines opened fire. Bolters barked, each round a miniature rocket. They hit Lobo with enough force to stagger him, detonating in his flesh. His torso became a crater. His jaw shattered. He fell backward off the corpse pile. The Marines advanced in perfect formation, their boots crushing skulls, their guns never pausing. They did not shout. They did not laugh. They moved like a ritual. Lobo regenerated as he rose, spitting teeth that grew back mid-air. He looked at them, taking in their size, their discipline, their absolute certainty. He clapped once, slow, mocking. Now this was quality. He charged. The first Marine met him with a chainsword. The blade screamed, chewing into Lobo's shoulder. Lobo grabbed the sword's teeth with his bare hand and stopped it, sparks spraying. The Marine's eyes widened behind the helmet. That was not supposed to happen. Lobo headbutted him. The helmet cracked. The Marine stumbled. Lobo tore the chainsword free and swung it with obscene strength, carving through armor that had endured artillery. A second Marine struck him with a power fist. The punch was like being hit by a tank. Lobo's ribs exploded outward. His heart ruptured. He flew through the air and crashed into a ruined wall, leaving a crater. He coughed blood and laughed. He stood, bones knitting, and sprinted back in. The Marines adjusted as they always did. They changed tactics. They flanked. They pinned. They used grenade bursts to shred his regeneration faster than it could complete. They fought not as individuals, but as one organism. For a moment it worked. They tore him apart. They reduced him to pieces. Then the pieces moved. Lobo's blood crawled back toward itself like red insects. His severed limbs dragged themselves across the dirt. His head rolled, biting a Marine's boot, and when the Marine looked down in disbelief, Lobo's head spat in his face. The Marines hesitated, not from fear, but from something worse. Confusion. Because their entire existence was built on the idea that everything could be killed if you applied enough faith and force. Even demons had rituals. Even Xenos had weaknesses. Even gods could be delayed. But this creature treated death like a mild inconvenience. A captain stepped forward, drawing a blade crackling with energy. The weapon hummed with sanctified power, a relic that had ended monsters. He struck Lobo clean across the chest. Lobo split open, torso parting, organs scattering. He fell to his knees. The captain raised the blade for the finishing strike, and for a second there was silence, a pause as if the universe was holding its breath. Then Lobo looked up, smiled, and grabbed the blade with both hands. His palm sizzled. His skin burned. The weapon tried to cut him. Lobo held it anyway, muscles flexing like steel cables. He leaned forward and said, "You guys are adorable." Then he yanked. The captain staggered as the blade was pulled from his grip. Lobo spun at once, testing the weight, and slashed upward, carving the Marine's helm clean off. The captain fell, not dead but stunned, his enhanced body fighting to understand the loss. The other Marines surged, roaring prayers or oaths. Lobo met them with a joy that was almost respectful. He fought harder now, because they deserved it. He took wounds that would have annihilated tanks. He lost limbs, regrew them, lost them again. He was killed, truly killed, his brain pulped, his body burned to ash. And then he came back laughing. The battlefield became legend in real time. Imperial Vox channels filled with frantic reports. Angels of death engaged. Target regenerates. Target laughs. Target is immune. The Marines began to understand something terrifying. They were not fighting a demon. They were fighting a force of nature that happened to enjoy punching things. Eventually, the fight slowed, not because either side won, but because the environment itself collapsed under the strain. Buildings fell. Fire spread. A munition dump detonated, turning the horizon into a wall of flame. The Marines pulled back, not retreating, but recalibrating. They had accomplished one thing. They had tested him. Lobo stood alone in the smoke, body steaming, armor stolen from enemies hanging from him like trophies. He watched the Marines withdraw, and for a moment there was something like disappointment on his face. Not because he wanted to win, because he wanted the game to continue. He shouted after them, voice echoing across the ruins, telling them to come back when they were serious. The Marines did not answer, but they remembered his voice. And somewhere in the Imperium's vast machinery of war, a new fear took root. Not fear of death, fear of a problem that refuses to end. A sector is not supposed to change because of one man. But Lobo was not one man in the Imperial sense. He was an anomaly that behaved like a contagion. Wherever he went, wars did not resolve. They escalated. Conflicts that might have ended in stalemate became endless because Lobo treated them like hunting grounds. Ork war bands followed his wake, believing he was a living omen of violence. Chaos cults chased him like addicts chasing their next high, hoping to witness the impossible. Imperial commanders begged for reinforcements, then begged for evacuation when reinforcements arrived, and made it worse. The Administratum tried to track him with paperwork. The Inquisition tried to track him with spies. The Space Marines tried to track him with threats. None of it worked, because Lobo did not move like an enemy commander. He moved like a drunk comet. 1 week he was on a forge world, ripping apart a demon engine because it looked expensive. The next he was on an agri world, using a harvester as a weapon in a brawl with orcs. The next he was in Deep Void, boarding a chaos cruiser just to steal its liquor. And every time the Imperium tried to pin him down, he slipped away, leaving wreckage and laughter. Eventually, the Inquisition reached its most sacred conclusion. If you cannot contain it, you burn the world it touches. Exterminatus. The order was not given lightly. It never was. Exterminatus was the Imperium admitting failure and calling it holy. A planet judged irredeemable. 1 billion souls condemned in the name of survival. The target world was a mining planet whose surface had become a battlefield of orcs, chaos, and desperate Imperial defense. Lobo had arrived 3 days prior. In that time he had killed an orc war boss, stolen the war boss's banner, and used it as a cape. He had fought a chaos sorcerer inside a cave system, collapsing the mine shafts and burying thousands. He had challenged an Imperial colonel to single combat over a misunderstanding about payment. The planet was already doomed. Lobo was just making it louder. The Exterminatus fleet arrived in orbit like a funeral procession. Ships aligned. Engines hummed. Priests chanted litanies that tasted like ash. The weapon chosen was fire, because fire cleansed and left no questions. Orbital bombardment began with a light brighter than sunrise. Lances of energy speared down, cutting through atmosphere, slicing continents into molten scars. Cities evaporated. Oceans boiled. The planet screamed, not as sound, but as seismic shuddering that could be felt even in orbit. On the surface, Lobo stood on a ridge of broken rock and watched the sky burn. He shaded his eyes with one hand, annoyed. He had been in worse explosions. But this one was rude. This one interrupted the fun. The first lance hit near him, vaporizing everything in a mile radius. Lobo was reduced to ash. His bike disintegrated. The orcs around him became shadows burned into stone. For a moment there was nothing. Then the ash moved. Lobo regenerated in the middle of the scorched crater, coughing, half-formed, bones knitting in the open air. Another lance hit, obliterating him again. Again he returned. Each time the bombardment hit, his body was erased, and each time his body returned. Not because it should, but because it refused the idea of ending on someone else's terms. In orbit, inquisitorial observers watched the Auspex readings with disbelief. There should have been no life. There should have been no motion. But the scanners kept catching a signature, a flicker, a persistent stain that would not wipe clean. They escalated again. Virus bombs were prepared, the kind that turned atmosphere into a death sentence. Biological fire that ate flesh and left only sludge. The warheads fell, rupturing in the upper sky, spreading invisible death. On the surface, Lobo smelled it and wrinkled his nose. The virus hit him. His skin blistered and sloughed. His organs liquefied. He fell, twitching, laughter turning into a wet cough. His body became a collapsing heap. Then, slowly, the heap hardened, reformed, rebuilt. His biology adapted in real time, not through evolution, but through brute refusal. He stood again, dripping half-healed tissue, and flipped the burning sky, the rudest gesture he knew. In orbit, the fleet prepared the final measure. Cyclonic torpedoes, planet breakers, weapons designed not to kill life, but to kill the world itself. The torpedoes struck deep, drilling into the mantle. The planet cracked. Volcanoes erupted like open wounds. The crust split into plates. Gravity trembled. Lobo was caught in the rupture, swallowed by molten rock, crushed by collapsing tectonic slabs. He screamed not in pain but in outrage. Then, as the planet broke, he floated in the exposed void, clinging to a fragment of rock like a man clinging to a bar stool in a hurricane. He looked around at the destruction, at the world becoming a debris field, and he laughed. Not because he enjoyed the death of a planet. He barely noticed the casualties. He laughed because the Imperium had tried its ultimate threat, its holy erasure, and all it had accomplished was making his day inconvenient. He drifted through space, skin frosting over, breath turning to crystals, eyes bright even as vacuum tried to steal heat from his blood. He did not need air the way mortals did. He needed only anger and momentum. A recovery ship attempted to lock onto him with tractor beams. Null fields pulsed. Containment arrays glowed. Lobo tore free anyway, grabbing onto the beam emitter, ripping it off the ship and hurling it into the void. He climbed onto the hull of the ship, punched through the plating, and stepped inside as if entering his own home. The crew screamed. The captain prayed. The inquisitorial agents drew weapons, already knowing it would not matter. Lobo walked to the bridge, looked out at the ruined planet, and sighed. Then he said, "Next time, give a guy some warning." The Inquisition, watching through encrypted channels, finally admitted something they hated more than death. Some things cannot be removed. Some things can only be endured. If you cannot kill the hunter, you learn to fear the sound of his laughter. By now, Lobo understood enough to be dangerous. He had learned that this galaxy ran on faith and fear like fuel. He had learned that the warp was not just a dimension, but a reflection of collective obsession. He had learned that in this universe, gods were real. And they were hungry. And the worst part was that he found it all hilarious. He began raiding demon realms the way other men raided liquor stores. Not with strategy, with swagger. He would find a warp rift, steer his stolen ship into it, and punch his way through the screaming boundary. He would emerge in landscapes that should have driven mortals mad. A desert of skulls under a red sky. A palace of living music where every note was a moan. A maze of shifting stairways made of glass and prophecy. A garden where flowers bloomed from corpses. Lobo treated each one like a new bar to trash. In the realm of corn, he rode his bike across plains of ash and blood, dodging rivers of molten brass. Demonic legions gathered to challenge him, roaring prayers to their god. Lobo revved his engine and shouted, "Who wants an autograph?" They charged. He met them head-on, leaving a trail of broken bodies and scattered skulls. He tore through bloodletters, ripping their blades away and stabbing them with their own weapons. He leapt onto juggernauts and rode them into their own ranks. He died under piles of axes and came back laughing inside the pile, exploding outward in a shower of gore. Deep in that realm, a massive fortress of brass rose, its gates carved from bone. Within, an avatar of corn manifested, not the god itself, but a shadow of its will, a towering war spirit crowned with flame. The avatar raised a blade and roared. Lobo looked up at it and whistled. He climbed the avatar like a mountain, stabbed it in the neck, and tore out something like a heart made of rage. The avatar staggered, screaming. Lobo held the heart up triumphantly. Then he bit into it. It burned like swallowing molten metal. He gagged, coughed smoke, then laughed anyway. The realm trembled with anger. He escaped not by running, but by leaping into the nearest blood river and riding it like a water slide back toward the rift, still laughing as demons chased him. In Slaanish's domain, the challenge was different. The realm was temptation-made architecture. Every surface offered pleasure. Every breath tasted like sin. Demons approached not with blades, but with kisses that could enslave souls. Lobo wandered through with an expression of mild annoyance, like a man walking through a perfume shop. A greater demon of Slaanesh approached, radiant and monstrous, offering him a place of honor, a banquet of sensation. It promised him he could be adored forever. Lobo leaned close, sniffed, and said it smelled expensive. Then he stole the demon's crown and ran, laughing, while the entire palace screamed in offended desire. Tzench's realm tried to drown him in complexity. The landscape changed with each step. Doors opened onto endless hallways of mirrored futures. Demons whispered secrets that could shatter sanity. Spells rewrote gravity. Lobo responded by refusing to care. He walked through walls. He punched through illusions. When the maze shifted, he simply turned and walked back the other way, insisting the maze was wrong, not him. It was absurd. And absurdity in the warp was a weapon. Eventually, he found a chamber where a minor warp god, a parasite deity of schemes, fed on the plans of mortals. It was not one of the big four, but it was powerful enough to have a throne, enough to have worshippers, enough to think it mattered. It looked at Lobo and tried to speak, voice full of prophecy. Lobo threw a grenade at its face. The god screamed as the explosion tore it apart, its essence splattering across the chamber like blue fire. Lobo laughed, grabbed a fragment of the deity like a trophy, and stuffed it into a pouch. Nurgle's realm was the only one that greeted him with something like warmth. It was rot and sickness, yes, but also a sickly affection, a grandfatherly chuckle from the garden's depths. Plague bears waved, offering him gifts of decay. Lobo stared at them, unimpressed, and said he already had enough problems with hygiene. A great bell tolled somewhere. The garden's air thickened with spores. Lobo began to cough, his lungs filling with rot. His skin blistered with infection. For once, his regeneration struggled, not because it could not heal, but because the disease was rewriting him as it healed. Lobo snarled, furious, not at pain, but at the audacity of being changed without consent. He punched the ground until it cracked, dug out a writhing root of corruption, and tore it out of the soil. The garden screamed. The rot retreated, offended. Lobo stumbled back toward the rift, coughing slime, then spat it out and watched it crawl away as a living creature. He laughed again. Not even disease could make him take this seriously. The chaos gods could not be killed. They were storms of belief, oceans of emotion. They were too vast to end. But Lobo did not need to kill them to hurt them. He hurt them by treating them like equals, by mocking them, by making their realms feel unsafe. In the warp, fear is nourishment. Worship is power. Respect is currency. Lobo paid none of it. He became their favorite nightmare, not because he could defeat them, but because he would not play his role. He was a being who treated eternity as a bar fight, who walked into divine realms and left with stolen trophies and rude jokes. The gods began to whisper his name, not as worship, but as warning. And in the cold dark of real space, cultists prayed for salvation from him, an inversion so obscene it made the warp itself shudder. Eventually, the galaxy learned the shape of its new curse. Lobo did not build an empire. He did not gather followers into a crusade. He did not carve out a kingdom like a warlord. Those were commitments, and commitments were boring. He wandered. Sometimes he took contracts from imperial nobles who were desperate enough to hire a monster to kill other monsters. Sometimes he took bounties from rogue traders who wanted artifacts pulled from forbidden worlds. Sometimes he took payment from chaos lords who thought they could control him with gold and flattery. And sometimes he took no payment at all because someone annoyed him. He became a roaming disaster that obeyed only his own amusement. On one world, he saved an imperial regiment by ripping apart a demon engine, then stole their transport and left them stranded. On another, he slaughtered a space marine squad because they tried to preach at him, then later killed the Ork war boss who celebrated, because the war boss was too loud. On a third, he fought alongside a chaos warband for 3 hours, laughing, then turned on them when their champion insulted his bike. No one could predict him. That was the worst part. The Imperium called him heresy made flesh, a hostile anomaly that could not be categorized. Inquisitors argued in sealed chambers about whether he was a Xenos, a demon, a lost Primarch, or something even stranger. Some whispered that he was a test from the Emperor. Others whispered that he was the Emperor's failure. The truth was simpler and more insulting. He was just Lobo. Chaos called him an insult. a being who walked through temptation like it was background noise. Cults tried to summon him like a patron saint of violence, only to find he arrived, laughed at their rituals, stole their offerings, and left them dead. Even the Orks, who adored him, began to feel uneasy. They loved a good fight, but they also loved the idea that fights had an Orky logic. Lobo did not follow Orky logic. He followed Lobo logic, which meant the fight could stop because he got bored, or get worse because he smiled. In some corners of the galaxy, stories grew, whispered in trenches, painted on the walls of underhive bars, told by survivors with shaking hands. A pale giant who cannot die. A hunter who rides through hell and comes back with trophies. A bastard who laughs at gods. Those stories became their own kind of faith, and faith in this universe always has consequences. Some Imperial commanders began to use his name as a threat to keep soldiers in line. Some cultists began to invoke him in prayers meant to ward off other demons. Some Orks began to carve his symbol onto their armor, believing it brought luck. Lobo did not notice. He drifted through the void in a stolen cruiser that barely held together, drinking from a keg bolted to the floor, staring at a bounty board made of stolen parchment and half-true rumors. The Grimdark future was supposed to be a place where hope died and duty replaced joy. But Lobo had found a loophole. He treated it like a vacation. When the Imperium tried to exterminate him, he survived. When Chaos tried to claim him, he laughed. When Space Marines tried to purge him, he came back for another round. The galaxy, already drowning in war, had gained a new problem. Not a savior, not a conqueror, not even a villain with a plan. A wild card with fists. And somewhere in the howling madness of the warp, gods watched him move through their domain like a drunk comet, and for once, the endless war of eternity had a new flavor. Not hope, not despair. Annoyance. Lobo grinned at the stars and set a course toward the next loud thing he could find. Because in a universe that worshipped war, he had finally found something wild enough to amuse him.